There is a stretch of the Baltic Sea, roughly halfway between the coasts of Finland and Sweden, where the water is about 80 meters deep. That is not the deep ocean. That is not some crushing, lightless abyss, unreachable by human hands. 80 meters is roughly the height of a 20-story building. In the context of maritime disaster, it is practically shallow. The people who drowned in that water on the night of September 28, 1994, drowned in water that a rescue diver could reach in minutes. They drowned in water where the wreck has been clearly visible on sonar from the day it settled on the seabed. They drowned close enough to shore that helicopters were scrambling from Finnish and Swedish bases within the hour. 852 people died, 137 survived. The MS Estonia went from a functioning, overnight passenger ferry, carrying families and tourists and business travelers across a route it had completed dozens of times, to a wreck on the bottom of the Baltic Sea in approximately 60 minutes. The bow visor, the massive hinged door at the front of the ship, through which cars drove aboard, tore away from the hull in the middle of a storm. Water flooded the open vehicle deck. The ship listed to starboard, and then, within a window of time so compressed that hundreds of people had no meaningful chance to respond, it was gone. That is the official version. And the official version is, in its mechanical description, essentially correct. But the official version omits the part of the story that makes the Estonia worth understanding, rather than simply mourning. Because the visor did not fail because of a freakish, unforeseeable event. It failed because of a design that experts in the maritime industry had already identified as dangerous. It failed because an inspection process mandated by international regulations was not carried out as required. It failed because the people responsible for certifying the ship as seaworthy had, according to a 2023 investigation, overlooked construction flaws that would have disqualified the Estonia from the route entirely. And it failed because the maritime industry had already watched a nearly identical type of failure kill 193 people 7 years earlier, on a different ship, in a different part of Europe, and had responded with regulatory reforms that were still being codified at the moment the Estonia sank. 852 people paid for a lesson the industry had already been charged tuition on once before. Let's go back to the beginning, not to the night of September 28, 1994. Further back than that, the MS Estonia was a roll-on, ferry, a design known in the industry as a RoRo. The RoRo concept was one of the most commercially successful innovations in passenger shipping of the 20th century. The idea is elegant in its simplicity. Instead of loading cargo by crane or by hand, you build a ship with a large opening at the bow or stern, lower a ramp, and drive vehicles directly aboard: trucks, cars, trailers. The vehicle deck runs the length of the ship, open and unobstructed, maximizing cargo space and minimizing turnaround time in port. It made overnight ferry routes across enclosed seas, like the Baltic, extraordinarily efficient. You drove onto the ship in Tallinn in the evening, found your cabin, had dinner in the restaurant, slept, and woke up in Stockholm in the morning. The car was in the hold. You drove off. Clean, fast, profitable. The problem with that design, the problem that engineers had known about for decades, and that regulators had been discussing since the 1970s, was the vehicle deck. A large, open, unpartitioned deck running the length of a ship is extraordinarily vulnerable to what engineers call the free surface effect. When water gets onto that deck, it doesn't stay in one place. It sloshes. It moves. As the ship rolls in heavy seas, the water shifts with the roll, amplifying the instability rather than counteracting it. A relatively small amount of water on a large open deck can compromise a ship's stability with terrifying speed. And the way water gets onto that deck, the opening through which it enters, in the case of the Estonia, is the bow visor. The Estonia's bow visor was a massive structure, essentially a hinged metal clamshell at the front of the ship. When open, it allowed the ramp behind it to lower, creating the opening through which vehicles drove aboard. When closed and locked at sea, it was supposed to form a watertight barrier, keeping the North Sea and the Baltic out of the vehicle deck. It was held in position by 3 locking mechanisms. 3. On a door roughly the size of a small house, exposed to the full force of North Atlantic and Baltic weather, on a ship carrying nearly 1,000 people. The Estonia had been built in 1980 by Meyer Werft in Germany. By 1994, it had been in service for 14 years, transferred between several operators and routes, and was now running the Tallinn-Stockholm route for a company called Estline. The route had been opened in 1993, part of the economic reorientation that followed Estonian independence from the Soviet Union. It was a popular route. Estonia, the country, had emerged into Western Europe's awareness as an affordable, interesting destination. Swedish passengers in particular traveled it regularly. On the night of September 27, 1994, when the ship departed Tallinn at 7:15 in the evening, 989 people were aboard, 803 passengers, 186 crew. Most of the passengers were Swedish. Most of the crew were Estonian. The weather that evening was what experienced Baltic mariners called normal for late September. Wind gusts up to 85 kilometers per hour. Significant wave heights of 4 to 6 meters. Rough, but routine. All other scheduled ferries on the Baltic were at sea that night, running their routes without incident. Nobody on the Estonia's bridge made any decision that evening that would have seemed unusual to an outside observer. The ship departed slightly behind schedule, sailing northwest through the Gulf of Finland, heading for the open Baltic. Passengers had dinner. The bars were doing business. People were in their cabins. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable, overnight that had happened on this route dozens of times before. What was not ordinary, although nobody on the ship knew it yet, was the condition of the bow visor. Investigators who examined the visor's locking mechanisms after the disaster found that the attachments were not manufactured properly according to the design intent. The welds were inadequate. The steel was insufficient for the loads it would routinely encounter. And critically, the certification process that was supposed to verify the structural integrity of safety-critical components, like the bow visor, had not been completed as required. A 2023 investigation by maritime safety authorities from Estonia, Finland, and Sweden was explicit on this point. If the inspection, following regulations, had actually been carried out, the flaws in the visor's construction would have been discovered. And if those flaws had been discovered, the Estonia would not have been certified as seaworthy for the Tallinn-Stockholm route. Read that again. The ship was not seaworthy. It had a certificate saying it was seaworthy. The certificate was wrong, because the inspection required to make the certificate meaningful had not been properly executed. The bow visor, classified as a safety-critical structural component, the literal barrier between the vehicle deck and the open sea, had not been inspected to the standard the regulations required. And the institutions responsible for that inspection had issued the certificate anyway, either through negligence, understaffing, misplaced trust in the shipyard's own documentation, or some combination of all three. The specific internal reason why the inspection was not completed as required has never been fully established. What has been established, clearly and officially, is that it was not. And 989 people boarded that ship on the evening of September 27, 1994, confident in the existence of a piece of paper that had been issued without the examination it was supposed to represent. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, on September 28th, the Estonia was roughly halfway across the Baltic Sea. The weather had intensified. The ship was rolling in 4 to 6 meter seas, moving at around 14 knots. Passengers in their cabins were experiencing the heavy, rhythmic roll of a ship in rough weather, uncomfortable. Perhaps alarming for those unaccustomed to it, but familiar to anyone who had taken this route before. And then there was a sound. Survivors described it differently. A bang, a clunk, a grinding metallic crash from somewhere forward. Some heard it once. Some heard it twice. The sound traveled through the hull, up through the floors of the cabins, and into the bodies of the people sleeping in them. On the bridge, 2 reports of unusual sounds from the bow area were received. Officers ordered an investigation. The officer who went to check the bow area reported nothing obviously wrong. The bridge maintained speed, 14 knots, into a Baltic storm, with a bow visor whose locking mechanisms had already been compromised beyond their structural capacity by the forces of the sea against them. What had happened, and what the investigation would later confirm, was that the visor's locks had already failed. The visor was already partially detached. The metallic sounds with the sound of that failure progressing, the remaining attachments tearing apart, under the combined force of the sea and the ship's forward momentum. Every minute the Estonia continued at speed was another minute of hydraulic force pressing against a door that was hanging on by mechanical threads. A reduction in speed, at that point, even a significant reduction, would have changed the pressure on the visor, potentially slowed or stopped its complete detachment, and bought time for the crew to understand what was happening and respond. Instead, the ship maintained speed. Shortly after 1 o'clock, the visor tore away from the hull entirely. It fell into the sea. The ramp behind it, the inner door between the vehicle deck and the ocean, was pulled partially open by the visor's detachment. The Baltic Sea began entering the vehicle deck of the MS Estonia at a rate the ship's design had never been intended to survive. The free surface effect, that phenomenon engineers had been discussing and regulators had been attempting to address for decades, now manifested in its most lethal form. Water on the vehicle deck. Moving water. Sloshing water. As the ship rolled, the water rolled with it, and each roll drove the water further toward the starboard side, increasing the list, which increased the speed at which water entered, which increased the list further. It was a feedback loop with only one terminus. The Estonia began to list to starboard, slightly at first, then more, then dramatically. By the time the list reached 30 degrees, an angle at which a ship's deck has tilted to something approaching the slope of a steep hillside. It was almost impossible for a person to climb toward the high side. At 45 degrees, the decks had become walls. At 90 degrees, which the Estonia reached within minutes of the critical flooding, the ship was lying on its side in the Baltic Sea. Here is where the human dimension of this disaster becomes unbearable to contemplate clearly, which is exactly why it must be contemplated clearly. At approximately 1:20 in the morning, a quiet female voice came over the public address system of the MS Estonia. In Estonian, she said, "Alarm, alarm, there is alarm on the ship." That was the first announcement passengers received. Not instructions, not a location to go, not a specific action to take. Just the word alarm, repeated, in a language that many of the passengers, Swedish, Finnish, German, Latvian, did not understand. The lifeboat alarm sounded approximately 5 minutes after the list had already become severe. No general information about what was happening or what passengers should do was broadcast over the public address system at any point during the entire event. None. The official report was direct about the crew's performance that night. It criticized the passive attitude of the crew, the failure to notice that water was entering the vehicle deck, the delay in sounding the alarm, and the lack of guidance from the bridge. Crew survival rates that night were 41%. Passenger survival rates were approximately 12%. The crew who survived did so in disproportionate numbers because they knew the ship's layout and were closer to escape routes. The passengers who survived did so largely because of factors that had nothing to do with the crew's guidance: youth, physical strength, proximity to an exit, and the random luck of which cabin they had been assigned. For the people in the lower decks, in the cheaper cabins, in the interior corridors, where there were no windows and no direct access to the open decks, what happened in those minutes is almost impossible to describe with the detachment that language imposes. The ship tilted, the lights went out, the furniture moved, the water came, in the dark, in a space that had become geometrically incoherent, where walls were becoming floors and floors were becoming walls. Hundreds of people tried to navigate toward air and light that receded faster than they could follow. Of the 989 people aboard, investigators estimate that approximately 310 reached the outer decks. 650 people are estimated to have still been inside the ship when it went under. Let that number sit. 650 people inside a sinking ship. They did not drown in the open Baltic. They drowned inside the MS Estonia, in corridors and cabins and stairwells, while the ship descended 80 meters to the bottom of the sea. Of the roughly 310 people who reached the outer decks, approximately 160 managed to board life rafts or lifeboats before the ship capsized completely. And then the water. The Baltic Sea on that night was around 10 to 11 degrees Celsius. 10 degrees. That is cold enough that hypothermia begins to impair judgment and physical function within minutes of immersion. At that temperature, a person in the water without a survival suit has a functional window of perhaps 30 to 60 minutes before the cold renders them incapable of holding onto a raft, calling for help, or keeping their head above the surface. Survivors in the water, or in the open life rafts that were frequently overturned by waves, that were designed for Baltic summer conditions and partially flooded in storm seas, had a survival window, measured in hours at most, and often in minutes. People who made it out of the ship, who had survived the chaos of the sinking, who had done everything right in the most impossible circumstances, died in the rafts because no one came in time. By the time the first rescue helicopter arrived, at 3 o'clock in the morning, 90 minutes after the Mayday call, roughly a third of those who had escaped the ship had already died of exposure. The demographic profile of who survived tells its own story. Of the 137 people rescued, 111 were men, and only 26 were women. 7 people over the age of 55 survived. There were no survivors under the age of 12. None. Every child on the MS Estonia that night died. That is not a random statistical outcome. That is physics and physiology intersecting with the geometry of a sinking ship. Younger children cannot climb a tilting staircase fast enough. They cannot push through a panicking crowd. They cannot hold on to a life raft in storm seas long enough for a helicopter to reach them. The survival curve of the Estonia disaster is a precise map of physical capability under extreme conditions, and it tells you exactly what those conditions were. One helicopter, a Finnish border guard, Super Puma, rescued 44 people that night, more than all the ships combined. The ships that arrived at the scene could not launch their own lifeboats in the storm conditions. The seas were too rough. The angle of approach too dangerous. The rescue infrastructure that existed for the Baltic, designed around the assumption that ships would take time to sink, that there would be an organized evacuation, that survivors would be in the water for manageable periods, was not adequate for a catastrophic capsize in rough weather in the middle of the night. The Mayday call itself had not been transmitted in the correct international format. which contributed to a delay in the Rescue Coordination Center, recognizing the full severity of what was happening. For nearly an hour after the first distress call, the disaster was not classified as a major accident. The full emergency designation did not come until 2:30 in the morning, 40 minutes after the Estonia had already disappeared beneath the surface. The rescue plans, the official inquiry noted, had been written with certain assumptions that the Estonia's sinking demolished in real time. Now, here is the part of this story that should make anyone who has followed it to this point genuinely angry. The Estonia was the 44th ro-ro passenger vessel lost within a 14-year period. The 44th, it was not an anomaly in a clean safety record. It was the latest entry in a category of disaster that the maritime industry had been producing with grim regularity since the ro-ro design became commercially dominant. 7 years before the Estonia sank, on the night of March 6, 1987, a British ro-ro ferry, called the Herald of Free Enterprise, left the port of Zeebrugge with its bow doors open. An assistant bosun, whose job it was to close the doors, had fallen asleep. The officer responsible for verifying the closure had assumed it had been done. The bridge had no indicator system to confirm the state of the bow doors, because the company had declined to install one when the ship's staff requested it, having determined the cost was not justified. Water flooded the open vehicle deck. The free surface effect did its work. The Herald of Free Enterprise capsized within 2 miles of the harbor. 193 people died. The investigation into the Herald of Free Enterprise was damning. It identified not just individual failures, but systemic ones. A company culture that prioritized operational efficiency over safety. A regulatory framework that had not kept pace with the known risks of the ro-ro design. And an industry-wide complacency about a failure mode that had been producing casualties for years. Reforms followed. The International Maritime Organization moved toward what became known as the SOLAS 90 standard, tightening stability requirements for passenger ships, and requiring cargo loading doors to remain closed until the ship was at its next berth. A new international safety management code was developed. Regulators, investigators, and industry bodies produced reports and recommendations and framework documents. And then, 7 years later, the Estonia sank through a failure of its bow structure in circumstances that were different in their specific mechanics from the Herald of Free Enterprise, but identical in their fundamental character. Water entered the vehicle deck of a ro-ro ferry through a structural failure at the bow. The free surface effect destabilized the ship, and hundreds of people died. The SOLAS 90 reforms, the reforms directly prompted by the Herald of Free Enterprise, had still not been fully codified when the Estonia went down. The Estonia sank the same year those reforms were being finalized. It became, in the bleak assessment of maritime historians, the proof that the reforms had not gone far enough, fast enough. There is a specific kind of institutional failure that recurs throughout the history of man-made disasters. It is the failure of an industry or regulatory body to treat the first catastrophic event in a known risk category as definitive evidence that the risk is real and the system must change, rather than as a data point to be incorporated into ongoing discussions about potential future reform. This failure has a name in organizational theory. It is called normalization of deviance. The concept was developed by sociologist Diane Vaughan in her analysis of the Challenger space shuttle disaster. But it describes a phenomenon that appears in nearly every major industrial catastrophe on record. An anomaly occurs. It is observed, it is assessed, it is deemed acceptable, or survivable, or tolerable within existing risk parameters. The anomaly is incorporated into the operational baseline as something that can be lived with, and it recurs, and recurs, and recurs, until the cumulative tolerance for the anomaly produces an outcome that the original anomaly was always capable of producing, but that nobody in the system had been willing to designate as the inevitable conclusion of the trajectory they were on. The ro-ro ferry industry between 1980 and 1994 was a system normalizing the deviance of vehicle deck flooding. 43 times before the Estonia, a ro-ro passenger vessel had been lost. The causes were not always identical, but the underlying physics, large, open deck, water ingress, free surface effect, catastrophic capsize, recurred across that loss record with a frequency that should have ended the debate about whether the design required fundamental structural change. It did not end that debate. It extended it. The Herald of Free Enterprise was the event that should have resolved the debate. The Estonia was the event that forced a resolution that the Herald of Free Enterprise had not been enough to produce. The Herald of Free Enterprise was the 44th lesson of a course that was apparently still being offered for the 44th time. The Estonia was finally the examination. The 2023 investigation, nearly 30 years after the sinking, confirmed something that made the entire tragedy more specific in its preventability. The certification process for the Estonia's bow visor had not been properly completed. The construction flaws in the visor, the inadequate welds, the insufficient steel, the locking mechanisms that were not manufactured to their own design specifications, were flaws that a proper inspection would have found. The certificate of seaworthiness was issued without the examination it was supposed to represent. The ship was sent to sea, carrying 989 people on the basis of a process that had not been followed. There is a language that industries use when they discuss their own failures. It is the language of human error and anomalous conditions and unforeseen combinations of factors. It is the language that locates the cause of a disaster in the specific, the accidental, the unforeseeable, because that framing contains the damage. If the Estonia sank because of a freak wave and a weak weld and bad luck, then no one needs to redesign an industry. If it sank because of a systemic failure of the certification process to verify what it claimed to verify, because of regulatory reform that moved too slowly to prevent a known failure mode from occurring again, because of a design philosophy that prioritized vehicle throughput over the structural integrity of the door, separating 989 people from the open sea, that is a different kind of story. That story asks questions that institutions prefer not to answer. The official inquiry published in 1997 was careful to distribute its criticism across multiple parties while centering the narrative on the bow visor as a mechanical event. It was not inaccurate, but it was incomplete in ways that took subsequent investigations decades to fill in. The 2023 preliminary assessment by the Estonian, Finnish, and Swedish safety investigation authorities was more specific. The bow visor's construction flaws, it found, had been overlooked during certification, rendering the vessel unseaworthy for the conditions it routinely encountered. The certification itself was incorrect, and if the certification had been correct, if the inspection had been done, the Estonia would not have sailed that route. That is not a small finding that arrived quietly 30 years after the fact. That is the finding. That is the sentence that contains the entire moral weight of 852 deaths. What happened after the Estonia matters, because what happened after matters in every disaster of this kind. In 1996, European states signed the Stockholm Agreement, which pushed the logic of the SOLAS 90 reforms further, and specifically addressed the conditions that had doomed ro-ro ferries in rough water. The Stockholm Agreement required that ro-ro passenger ferries be capable of surviving with half a meter of water already on the vehicle deck, meaning the ship had to be stable and survivable, even in the condition that had sunk the Estonia. It forced a redesign of how the entire category of vessel thought about damage stability. Bow visors on existing ships were replaced or reinforced across the Baltic fleet. New ships were built with internal watertight compartments that the ro-ro design had historically sacrificed in the name of vehicle access efficiency. When a ferry comparable to the Estonia in size and speed took a serious hit to its hull structure in the Baltic in 2002, it did not sink. It listed. Its crew managed the damage. It reached port. The passengers survived. That outcome, that ordinary, unremarkable survival, was the Stockholm Agreement working. It was the regulatory reckoning that the Estonia had forced, finally producing the engineering reality it had been designed to produce. The wreck of the MS Estonia lies 80 meters below the surface of the Baltic Sea. It was designated a graveyard under an international agreement signed by Estonia, Sweden, and Finland in 1995, prohibiting diving to the site by private parties. Most of the 852 people who died are still inside it. Only 94 bodies were ever recovered. The ship was not salvaged. The government that had initially promised salvage reversed that decision in December 1994, 3 months after the sinking, citing cost and technical complexity and the distress that further intervention would cause to the families of the victims. Whether that decision was purely logistical or also protective of something else, some truth about the ship's condition, some acknowledgement of regulatory failure that a closer examination of the wreck might have forced, is a question that has driven decades of conspiracy theorizing and legitimate investigative pressure in equal measure. A Swedish documentary in 2020 claimed to have found a large hole in the Estonia's hull. The resulting investigations confirmed that the hole exists, but attributed it to impact damage when the vessel struck the seabed. The 2023 investigation found no evidence of collision, explosion, or external sabotage. What the 2023 investigation did find, and what it stated plainly, is that the ship was not seaworthy, that the certification said it was, and the certification was wrong, that the required inspection was not done, and that if it had been done, 852 people who went to bed on a Baltic ferry expecting to wake up in Stockholm would most likely be alive. Here is the thing about maritime safety that the Estonia teaches, and that the Herald of Free Enterprise had tried to teach 7 years earlier, and that the 42 other ro-ro losses in the 14 years before that had been trying to teach with diminishing success. The sea does not negotiate. It does not grant exceptions for commercial efficiency or regulatory timelines, or institutional preference for gradual reform over disruptive change. When a door at the front of a ship fails, in storm conditions, and the water gets in, and the physics takes over, the sea does not care what the certificate says. 852 people drowned in 80 meters of water that a rescue diver could reach. They drowned in a body of water, flanked by two of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced countries in the world. They drowned while rescue helicopters were being scrambled, while other ships were turning toward the coordinates of the Mayday call, while the infrastructure of a modern, organized European maritime rescue system was being activated. They drowned faster than that system could respond, because a ship certified as seaworthy was not seaworthy, and because the industry's response to the previous catastrophic demonstration of the same fact had been a process of regulatory reform that was still unfinished when the Estonia went under. The Stockholm Agreement is real. The reforms are real. The ferries crossing the Baltic today are safer than the ones that crossed it in 1994. The lesson was learned. But it was learned at a cost that should not have been the price of the lesson, because the lesson had already been taught in 1987, on a different ship, in a different sea, to the same industry, with the same result. If you understand now why 852 deaths in a shallow European sea are not simply a maritime accident, but a case study in what happens when the gap between identifying a systemic risk and actually eliminating it is measured in years rather than months, leave the word Estonia in the comments. Because the people who understand the difference between a tragedy and a consequence are the ones who know how to ask the right questions the next time they're on a ship, the next time they're on a plane, the next time someone tells them that something is certified and compliant and approved and safe. And if you want to see how this exact same failure pattern, known risk, documented warning, inadequate response, catastrophic outcome, plays out on land, with different machinery and different victims, and the same institutional logic, there is a video on this channel that will make everything you just learned about the Estonia feel deeply, uncomfortably familiar. It is on the screen right now. Watch it before you decide you already understand how this works. Because understanding it once is not the same as recognizing it in every form it takes.